Hello there and welcome to the programme. I'm Nick Clark. So, despite its war on Gaza, Israel still plays a full part in international sport and in other competitions on the world stage, including Eurovision. It's been largely business as usual, despite accusations of genocide by UN bodies and Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's indictments by the International Criminal Court for war crimes. But pressure is intensifying for action against Israel. All right, let's get into this straight away. Let's speak to our guests. In London, we have Ashish Prashar, who's a political strategist, former advisor to the Middle East envoy Tony Blair, and campaign director for the Game Over Israel campaign. In Tel Aviv, we welcome Dan Perry, a former editor of the Associated Press in Europe, the Middle East and Africa. He's now the publisher of Ask Questions Later on Substack. And also in the United Kingdom, in Oxfordshire, Andrew Feinstein, an anti-apartheid activist and author who was elected as ANC Member of Parliament under Nelson Mandela in South Africa's first democratic election in 1994.
Look, I'm a critic of the war and of the Netanyahu government, make no mistake. But I'm not a fan of cultural and sports boycotts and the mixing of sports and politics, which tends to backfire, which tends to target precisely those constituencies that actually are on your side. Academic boycotts of Israel target a community that 90% of them oppose the government and the war. But primarily, I look at the outcome here. We're at a very delicate juncture where a peace plan is going to be proposed, probably today in Washington, that would include and that would require Hamas disarming, stepping aside and handing over control of the Strip to a civilian government. Anything perceived as strengthening Hamas, as giving it a reward for its decision to attack Israel and start this war, I fear will undermine the ability of the world and of the Arab world to compel Hamas to indeed accede to these demands, without which there will not be an end to the war. End of story.
What about, Dan's point, his point about timing, that doing something like this now, implementing a ban now, jeopardizes the push for peace?
Well, first of all, I'm afraid to say that I'd be quite skeptical of a peace plan that was coming out of the current White House, to be honest, from where we've heard, talk of turning the Strip into the Riviera of the Middle East, amongst many other things. And some of the plans that are being proposed are actually quite terrifying. That's the first thing. Second of all, the reality is that the countries who are proposing this peace plan, the United States of America, the United Kingdom, some countries in the EU, are massive contributors to the ongoing genocide in terms of weaponry, in terms of spy flights, in terms of the training of Israeli defense personnel. So I think that in terms of timing, there has to be this push for isolation so that even if a peace plan is put on the table, Israel is compelled to accept it under pressure. There have been ceasefire offers that Netanyahu has rejected. At the moment, you could argue that if the conflict comes to an end, Netanyahu could not only find himself out of power, he could find himself in jail on numerous corruption charges.
Dan, what about that? What's your response to that? That isolation kind of forces Israel into a corner, makes them more likely to accept a peace process?
Well, my suspicion is that Netanyahu will accept this plan that my colleague here disdains, which in fact is, I believe, in alignment with what most of the world wants, including what the Arab League wants. I think we have to understand something that maybe sometimes goes unsaid. There is cognitive dissonance in the global system here. The vast majority of people, including the vast majority of people in Israel, want the war to end. That's clear. But just as true is that the vast majority of people, I think governments for sure, including the governments of the Arab League, want Hamas to disarm and let go of the Strip, which they have hijacked and whose population they have been oppressing for 20 years. Now, the only force on earth right now that actually seems to have a plan for forcing Hamas to disarm, weirdly, is the government of Israel, but no one likes their tactics.
UEFA will throw them out of club football. They're going to throw them out of European championships. They're going to throw them out of everything else that falls under their remit. But in the end, the only way we can pressure FIFA to finish the job, and it should be finished, because October 7th don't matter anymore. Let's just be honest. A genocide where some people estimate 600,000 people are being massacred. We should continue that isolation, that punishment, and yes, collective, given that what collectively is being done to Palestinians is beyond anything we've ever seen in humanity in the timeline. Right? What's actually being done to Palestinians is collective responsibility right now. Right, can I just finish my point? I've been really respectful of you in this time. So in the timeline that they've committed this and the weapons they've used, right, this should be collective responsibility.
And Dan, do come in there, but keep it brief if you would.
There absolutely is a double standard because the situation is not equivalent. Russia attacked Ukraine. Israel was attacked by Hamas. There is no credible force on earth that supports.
Ashish, hold on, Ashish. Ashish, hold on for a second. Let Dan make his point, then you can come back in very briefly.
Where there have been boycotts. There was no argument whatsoever for the goal of apartheid, which was to continue racial discrimination in South Africa. There is no argument for Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine and its desired outcome, which is the domination of Ukraine by Russia. There is near global support for Israel's goals in this war, which are the freeing of Gaza from Hamas. That should be clear. They don't like the tactics Israel's used, and neither do I. But there is a very major difference. Now, we should be very careful about introducing politics into sports and entertainment and academia because there's no end to it. What next? Are we going to ban the U.S., the host of the World Cup next year, because they deny climate change?
Andrew, let's move it on because, as far as the Russia element is concerned, the president of UEFA, indeed himself, has said that we are among the first to act, truly believing that sport could help put an end to this tragedy. Did it stop the war? No, it didn't.
No, it didn't. But did it add to the pressure on Russia? Absolutely it has. I mean, we've seen Russian tennis players who aren't able to play under their national flag, which has caused great problems for them. Does this add pressure on the politicians who are keeping the war going? Of course it does.
Dan, I'm just wondering if we just flick to Israel itself for a moment. How do the majority of people there feel about this potential ban and this growing sense of isolation? You know, the phrase the pariah state has used is bandied about quite a bit. What's the sense within Israel amongst the majority of people about that growing isolation?
Well, it's absolutely true that there is growing isolation, and it's also true that economic boycotts in particular and pressure like that can yield outcomes, undoubtedly. But the cognitive dissonance I mentioned before exists in Israel as well. Most people want the war to end, but pretty much everyone supports the goal of removing Hamas from power and disarming them one way or another. And the belittling of this goal by my fellow panelists here is positively absurd. You say most of the world doesn't care about disarming Hamas? Really? Maybe you should ask the people in Gaza. And by the way, Hamas was not elected to rule Gaza. No, please. I was respectful to you guys. Hamas was not elected to rule Gaza. Hamas won a plurality, not a majority, in legislative elections for West Bank and
Gaza.
Gaza.
We're really going off piste here. Let's stick to the subject, Dan, please.
I'm explaining that this could really backfire, and the people in Israel, probably the third or so that still support the war, are not going to be convinced by any version of this sort of punishment, whereas the 2/3 or more that want to end the war already want to end the war. They don't need compelling. And, removing them from the family of nations, I'm not so sure is the right thing to do. Like I say, there's no end to it. The minute we introduce politics, there's no end to it. Consider that most knowledgeable factors in the world understand that it's bad for the Palestinians for Hamas to continue to exist as a militia undermining the Palestinian Authority. For God's sake, how can we ignore this very basic and obvious thing?
Okay.
There is no defense for Russia. There was no defense.
Ashish, another argument.
But this case is more complex.
All right, Ashish, another argument that Dan alluded to there was the kind of, in a way, indirectly, the unifying nature of sport. The case that sport and culture, provide this chance to bring people together and should stay outside of politics, and it could help the furtherance of peace and understanding. And Ashish, that's a good argument, isn't it?
Look, the point I'm making is, Israel, the UN declared it a genocide. Navi Pillay is beyond reproach on this issue. She's done Rwanda, many other genocides. It doesn't matter what the scholar says in Tel Aviv or anyone else. By the way, Israeli scholars have called it a genocide. Punishment of that is collective. Unfortunately, this is a society that has done one of the most horrific crimes imaginable. And sports normalizes the acceptance of genocide. If we allow them in normal arenas, we accept that this genocide is okay. The apartheid that Israel have over Palestinians is okay. And the occupation they have over Palestinians is okay. And they have to be isolated. And that starts with sport. And once football goes, the Olympics weeks will go. They are more like South Africa than Russia. The isolation will cripple them, to Andrew's point, and then economically cripple them. And bringing them off the table of other nations is the most important thing we can do to bring an end to this and deliver justice for the Palestinians who suffered in this genocide.
OK, Dan, briefly come back on that, that sport normalizes what Israel is doing.
What Israel is doing is not comparable to the crimes that you mentioned. You keep saying genocide as if saying it 100 times and falsely attributing it to the entire UN.
Dan, my point is about the normalization, that sport normalizes what's going on. So get to that, if you would.
The situation is abnormal and the situation is complex. And what needs to happen is for the things I said before, for Hamas to disarm and to step down. That's it. If the minute that happens, the war is over. And that really undermines the claim that Israel intends to destroy the Palestinian people in whole or in part. They intend to achieve the goals of this war, and the manner in which they are doing it is very ugly, and I am no fan of it. But I am aware, which you guys seem not to be, that if Hamas surrendered tomorrow, gave up the hostages, and handed over the keys, the war would end. The so-called genocide would end. You seem unaware of this.
If we assume that genocide is being committed to achieve whatever objectives Israel wants to achieve, and unfortunately in this instance, the means simply cannot justify the end because we are seeing a genocide. The reality is we in the rest of the world have to do every single thing we can to bring to an end this genocide. Sports boycotts are the very least we can do. Sports boycotts should be part of a process that leads to massive and total BDS and isolation of the state of Israel.
And Dan, isn't this the essential point? We're just coming to the end of the programme, so briefly, if you would, that aside from everything else and the disagreements that you guys have, isn't isolating Israel from sporting, cultural and academic contact, won't that make it clear to ordinary Israelis that their government's policies have a cost and should not continue, and something's got to change?
I think it's very clear. Then most Israelis know that, which is, again, why most Israelis want to end the war. I think the tool of isolation and boycotts and being expelled from sports tournaments should be reserved for the very few cases where there is absolutely no defense of what a country is doing and there is wall-to-wall opposition to everything about that policy. This is not the case here. And even if you guys repeat genocide falsely 100 times on the show, it will not make it genocide. Israel is supported by most of the world and most of the world governments in its goals, and I've repeated them ad nauseum on the show. And the war would end if those goals were achieved. So therefore, this is not the case where boycotts are necessarily wise. What needs to happen is massive, maximal pressure on Hamas to free the poor people of Gaza from their grip.
OK, have to see how events unfold, gents. So do appreciate your time. Thanks very much indeed for speaking to us. Ashish Prashad, Dan Perry and Andrew Feinstein. Thanks very much indeed.